What if the world decided to control your body and define what it meant? What if the shape of your body became justification for study, for profit, and for violation? In the early 1800s, Europe called this the progress of science. And at the center of this so-called progress stood a Black woman, stripped of dignity, reduced to measurements, and denied humanity. This is episode 5 of Exploited Bodies, the history of medical crimes and injustice against Black women. Today, we shine light on Saartjie Baartman, the woman science put on display to justify exploitation. Saartjie Baartman, also known as Saartjie Baartman, was born around 1789 near the Gamtoos River, in what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Her original birth name is unknown, a loss that reflects how often colonial record-keeping erased indigenous identities, especially those of Black men and women. Sarah was Khoikhoi, part of the broader Khoikhoi people, the traditionally nomadic pastoralist indigenous community. By the time Sarah was born, the Khoikhoi were already being systematically dismantled. Their culture and autonomy were violently stripped away. Their land was seized, their labor exploited, and many were forced into servitude under Dutch settlers through coercive colonial laws and practices. Sarah's life was marked by tragedy and loss from the very beginning. Historical accounts indicate that her mother died when she was an infant, and that her father was later unalived while she was still very young. Some records suggest that as a teenager, Sarah may have been married and may have had children who passed away in infancy, though these details remain uncertain due to the fragmentary and often biased nature of colonial documentation. What is known is that by early adulthood, most of Sarah's family had been unalived, displaced, or scattered. Like many Khoikhoi women, Sarah was forced into domestic servitude on Dutch farms. Eventually, she became the servant of Peter Caesar, a freed Black trader who later moved her to Cape Town. There, she worked as a washerwoman and nursemaid, both forms of labor commonly imposed on indigenous and enslaved women. Sarah was later sent to live in Woodstock, just outside of Cape Town, in the household of Peter's brother Hendrik Caesar, where she served as a wet nurse. It was during this period that her body began to attract attention. In exchange for small payments, Hendrik began showing Sarah to visitors, including parading her around at the Cape Town Hospital, where Alexander Dunlop, a Scottish military surgeon, worked. Alexander Dunlop recognized that European fascination with racial differences, particularly Black women's bodies, could be turned into profit. He then suggested to the Caesar brothers that Sarah be taken to Europe. Sarah was presented with a contract. Despite being illiterate with little understanding of European law or language, she was told she would travel, perform, earn money, and return home wealthy. In a world where survival itself was fragile, this contract was a promise and a chance to leave poverty behind. In 1810, she allegedly signed that document, unaware that it would bind her not to opportunity, but to exploitation, violation, and dehumanization on a global stage. When Saartjie Baartman arrived in London in 1810, she was stripped of her name and renamed the Hottentot Venus, a derogatory label rooted in racial slurs, colonial violence, and sexual mythology. In England, her exhibitors, including Hendrik Caesar and Alexander Dunlop, organized public exhibitions of her body. Members of the public paid to see her, while Sarah herself received little to no compensation. Her first major exhibition took place at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, a popular venue for curiosities and spectacles. She was also displayed in public showings, where audiences could get closer, sometimes touching her body without consent. She was forced to stand on platforms, where she was ordered to turn, pose, and endure. Crowds stared, mocked, and examined her body, especially her hips and buttocks, which Europeans falsely framed as proof of African inferiority and sexual excess. Sarah possessed physical traits common among some Khoikhoi women, including steatopygia, a natural genetic phenotype characterized by an increased distribution of adipose tissue in the hips and buttocks areas. However, European audiences stripped these natural traits of cultural and biological context and weaponized them, turning biology into ideology. Sarah was put on display dressed in skin-tight clothing, and at times barely clothed at all. This was intentional. Her attire was designed to expose and exaggerate her body, transforming her into a spectacle for voyeurism. Disturbed by what they witnessed, British abolitionists brought a legal case in 1810, arguing that Sarah Baartman was being enslaved, abused, and coerced into exhibition. The case was heard at the Court of King's Bench, a rare moment where her exploitation was publicly questioned. In court records, one abolitionist described her treatment in stark terms. They would state, "This unfortunate female was shown as any beast, as a bear led by a chain. Her keeper ordered her to place herself in any position he desired, and she was obliged to obey." The court was then presented with the contract of consent that Sarah had allegedly signed. Sarah herself was also brought in to testify. Sarah stated that she had consented and that she was not being mistreated. The case was eventually dismissed, but this was not consent. It was coercion. Sarah was a woman with no power, no protection, and no meaningful alternative. She was isolated in a foreign country, dependent on her enslavers for survival. In September 1814, Sarah was taken to Paris, where her conditions worsened. By this point, Sarah was living in extreme poverty and had earned none of the wealth she had been promised. She was eventually sold to Jean Riot, a French animal trainer. Under his control, the exploitation became even more degrading. Sarah was reportedly made to wear a collar and, in some settings, displayed alongside animals. This spectacle was never just about her. It was about preserving a system that required the dehumanization of an entire race to justify its own existence. Sarah Baartman's body became the subject of both racist scientific scrutiny and sexual fantasy. In Paris, the exploitation of Sarah was no longer framed as entertainment. It was reframed as science. French naturalists and anatomists measured her body, stretched her, cataloged her features, and debated publicly whether she was fully human. At the center of this scrutiny was Georges Cuvier, one of the most influential scientists in France and a leading figure in comparative anatomy and natural history. Often referred to as the founding father of modern anatomy and paleontology, Cuvier's authority gave legitimacy to ideas that were anything but objective. He explicitly compared Sarah's physical features to those of animals, framing her body as evidence of racial hierarchy rather than human variation. Under the guise of scientific inquiry, Sarah was brought into medical facilities, laboratories, and private examination rooms, where her body was treated as a specimen, not as a person. Her humanity was stripped away, replaced by measurements, sketches, and pseudoscientific conclusions. Sarah Baartman passed away in 1815, at approximately 26 years old. And even after her passing, she was not allowed to rest, and the exploitation of her body continued. An autopsy was performed, yet her cause of death was never definitively established. Some historical accounts suggest smallpox, while others point to untreated syphilis or pneumonia. Georges Cuvier would then dissect her body. Her brain was preserved, her skeleton was mounted, and a plaster cast of her body was created. Sarah Baartman's body was repeatedly used to reinforce violent scientific myths. These ideas did not remain in the past. They became the foundation of scientific racism, eugenics, and medical practices that treated Black bodies less than worthy of care and more suitable for experimentation. For more than 150 years, Sarah Baartman's remains were displayed in French museums, long after human exhibitions were said to have ended. In 2002, after decades of activism led by South African scholars, cultural leaders, and descendants of the Khoikhoi people, Sarah Baartman was finally returned to South Africa, where she was laid to rest with dignity. But restitution does not erase history. Sarah Baartman was a melanated woman with beautiful curves and features. Yet she was turned into a spectacle, reduced to a fantasy, and pathologized, not because of who she was, but because she did not conform to European beauty standards. But her beauty was never the problem, the system was. And even after Sarah, these beliefs did not disappear. They were reshaped, renamed, and passed down through generations. Today, many of these features once used to justify Sarah's abuse are now commodified, surgically replicated, and celebrated, while Black women themselves continue to face discrimination, hypersexualization, and medical neglect. Sarah's life was filled with loss and cruelty. She was exploited and denied dignity, but she was more than what the world portrayed her to be. She was a daughter, a woman, and a human being, and her legacy deserves respect, remembrance, and truth. No story should be forgotten, no voice should go unheard. To Miss Sarah Baartman, I pray that you rest in peace. Until the next time, I'm Lock Jewel, and thank you for watching Shades of Crime. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and remember to pray. God's listening.